This is lecture week 3, part 3, the last part of this lecture where we finally dive into our very first policy, and that's the earned income tax credit. So we'll look here at the nuts and bolts of the program and how it operates. But first, just a little bit in the way of background about the earned income tax credit. So this was a program that was first passed in 1975 as a result of some experiments that were conducted at the state level that were found to be successful. In particular, we had what was called the New Jersey negative income tax experiment, where they were experimenting with the idea of this tax credit, or in other words, the negative income tax. And so what the researchers did was they assigned people to experimental group, to experimental conditions, and to control group conditions. And to the experimental group, they provided negative income tax, or tax credit, in other words. And then to the control group, they withheld the negative income tax, the tax credit. And so recall that we've always had a concern in terms of policy about this trade-off between equality and efficiency, that if, in the Rawlsian context, that if you set the social minimum too high, if you redistribute income, if you redistribute too much, then it takes away the incentive to work hard. That if we provide greater benefits to our low-income populations, that it might take away their incentive to work hard. But what this experiment showed was that the experimental group, even though they were receiving government benefits in the form of the negative income tax, despite the expectation that they would work less, it was actually found that they worked more. So the experimental group, the group that received the tax credit, worked more than the group that didn't receive the tax credit in this study. And so that was part of the evidence that was used to pass the earned income tax credit. And so since 1975, there have been other studies that have sort of confirmed those findings. And so we've expanded the program over the years. And of course, there are certain eligibility requirements that we impose on recipients, on potential recipients. The main one being that you must work, right? So it's an earned income tax credit. So if you don't have any earnings, the program doesn't apply to you. And there's lots of different eligibility requirements, which we won't really get into. But for example, you must be age 25 if you want to claim higher levels of credits. You must make sure that your child is present with you. So just note that there are other legal requirements to claiming this credit. You see here behind me, sort of a big glob. It may look like a big glob to you, but there's actually some structure here in terms of how the EITC operates. So let me do this. Let me just get out of the screen and show you how this program operates. So give me 1 second here. All right, so please ignore this sign here. This is a smart screen, but basically what I wanted to show you is that the earned income tax credit is based on a 3-part structure. There's a phase-in stage, there's a plateau stage, and there's a phase-out stage. Okay, that's the first thing to note. So in terms of the earned income tax credit, I just showed you previously the schedule for single individuals, right? Single individuals with 1 child, single individuals with 2 kids, single individuals with 3 or more kids. But regardless of how many kids, the same structure applies. So let me label my axes here. So on my horizontal axis, on this particular axis, I'm talking about earnings. Right? So the horizontal axis refers to earnings, and on the vertical axis here, I'm referring to the amount of the credit. Okay, and so you'll note that during this phase-in stage, which ends at $6,370 of earnings, you're going to get a credit of 7.65% on each dollar that you earn. So on the first dollar that you've earned, as a low-income worker, on the first dollar that you've earned, you'll earn 7.65 cents of a tax credit. On the second dollar, another 7.65 cents, all the way up to $6,370, at which point your tax credit will plateau. And that's so your maximum credit, if you note the table, if you're following along with your PowerPoint slides, you'll note that the maximum credit amount is $450 approximately. And so it doesn't matter if you're making $6,370 or all the way up to $7,970, the tax credit will be the same. It's on the order of $450. But then the government says that if you make too much, if you make beyond $7,970, the government is going to start to claw back. Literally, they're going to claw back a certain percentage, and that percentage is 7.65%. As noted in your table, they're going to claw back at the rate of 7.65%. So on $7,971, they're going to claw back 7.65 cents of your credit. On $7,972, they'll claw back another 7.65%, all the way up to complete phase out, at which point you're not going to receive any credit at all. So this is the basic structure that we're working with here. And so it doesn't matter, this is for a single individual claiming credits for themselves. And so the maximum credit amounts, of course, will differ depending on the number of kids that you have, that you're responsible for. And so we'll take a look, we'll switch back to the other screen and take a look at the rest of these slides here. So give me 1 second. So recall the three-part structure. Let me just erase this so you can see. So you can see this schedule. For a single individual, there's a 7.65% credit, all the way up to $6,370. Your maximum credit, I'm sorry, I misspoke. It's now $487. It's the maximum credit amount for a single individual. And note, the maximum credit amounts will differ depending on the number of kids in your family. The maximum credit amount, if you have one child, is $3,250. Right? It spikes up considerably for if you have kids in the family. 2 kids, it's $5,372 is the maximum credit amount. And for 3 or more kids, doesn't matter if you have 3 or 4 or 5 or 10. There's a maximum credit of $6,044. So that's the basic structure of the EITC. And so let me give you this example here, just a calculation to show exactly how these things work. So let me give you a realistic example. You have a single parent, and let's say she has 2 kids, and she earned $19,000, we say. We're saying that she earned $19,000. And so the first thing we note, we want to know if she has any tax liability, because the tax credit doesn't kick in until we figure how much she owes in the way of taxes. And so I note here that there's no income tax liability. She doesn't owe anything in the way of taxes. Now pause for a second here and think about why that is. Right, so that's going to be because of what we said before about exemptions and deductions, right? So we noted that these are reductions in your taxable income. And so she doesn't owe anything in the way of taxes because there's 3 people. First, figure what she owes in the way of, or what she's entitled to in the way of exemptions. There are 3 people in her filing unit, herself and her 2 kids, so she's entitled to 3 exemptions. In other words, $3,900 multiplied by 3, or $11,700. She's entitled to exemptions in the amount of $11,700. And then she's entitled to her standard deduction, depending on the type of filing unit, how she files. So she's not going to, if she's being logical, rational, she's going to file as the head of household because she has a greater standard deduction. Note before, when we talked about standard deductions. So I'm going all the way back. Note that the standard deduction amount for a head of household is $8,950 as opposed to $6,100. So she's going to claim this deduction. That's what I'm assuming here, right? So if she's being rational, she's going to claim that, that greater deduction or standard deduction. And so we're talking about her tax liability. So when she claims those exemptions, she's entitled to the exemptions and deductions, and it wipes out her taxable income. She has no income for tax calculation purposes, in other words, and therefore she has no tax liability. She doesn't owe anything in the way of taxes, so that's when the earned income tax credit comes into play. So what we're trying to figure out here is how much she's going to get back from the federal government in the way of a tax credit, of an earned income tax credit. So we have to go to the appropriate schedule. Remember, she has 2 kids. The amount of the credit is based on the number of kids in her filing unit. She has 2 kids, and so she's entitled to maximum credit of $5,372. Right? That's what I note here. The next question you have to ask yourself is there a clawback? Does she make so much that the government will start to claw back into her maximum credit amount such that it's reduced? Well, where does that clawback start? I note here that the clawback starts at $17,530 of earnings. So if you have a person who makes more, than $17,530, the clawback will kick in. And she makes more than $17,530. She made $19,000. And so the clawback applies to the difference, just to the difference between how much she made and that clawback starting point, right? So the difference is, we're talking about $1,470, right? And so there is a clawback. If you're asking yourself, is there a clawback? The government will claw back 21%, $1,470. And I gave you what that amount is. The actual amount of the clawback is $308.70. So in conclusion, if you're trying to figure out what sort of credit she's entitled to, what sort of check she's going to get back from the federal government, she's going to get back the total, the maximum credit, minus the clawback, which comes out to $5,063. And so $5,063 is not just a small sum of money. If you're thinking in terms of her total earnings, it comes out to 26.65% of her total earnings. So a substantial amount, a substantial benefit to this low-income worker. I think it's a pretty slam-dunk case in terms of its effect on low-income families. Now, this exercise, I'm going to let you take a crack at this exercise by yourself, and of course, in our face-to-face meeting, we can talk through what you found for this particular exercise. Okay? All right, so just one last note about EITC. This is a very important program, and I cover it first. I think it's where we're headed in terms of our social programs nowadays. More and more, we're administering our social programs through the tax code. Part of it for stigma reasons. Everyone pays taxes, so there's less stigma that attaches. But one of the issues nowadays with this type of program is that there's the potential for fraud, right? So the issue that IRS is having to deal with nowadays is you saw how substantial the benefits are, or the credits are, depending on the number of kids in the family. And so sometimes you have non-custodial parents, parents who don't necessarily have custody of the kids, but who are claiming for tax purposes that the child or children is in fact living with them for more than 6 months out of the year and such. And so the IRS is having to deal with this type of fraud. But note here, I just note that this is the largest anti-poverty program that we have currently, which is why I cover it first. It's a very important policy, and I give you some of the figures here. More than 27 million families now receiving some form of credit, and we're dishing out in excess of $62 billion in the way of a tax credit, and we see the average amount to families $2,200. So that's the EITC. We'll talk more. We can go back and forth about how this program works in our face-to-face sessions, but that's the end of this lecture, and for next week we'll dive into issues of diversity, and we cover two different aspects of diversity. We'll talk about gender and race. So that concludes the third part of this lecture.